Hello, and welcome to a topic that we're going to cover on Ask the Divorce Experts that may be uncomfortable for some people. So, I do want to say at the very beginning that this may have a triggering effect. We are going to be talking about domestic violence and the impact on families. And this is not an episode that you're going to want to listen to in front of your children. So, if you do have little ones, put it on pause right now, get them out of the room or put your earbuds in, and then we're going to continue with the conversation. So with that warning up there in front, and again, we're not going to be talking about anything that's hopefully too traumatic for people, but I just always like to let people know when we've got these sensitive subjects. So I am honored to be able to speak to a lady that I had the opportunity to meet in person and spend a few days in a training with. And I just really so admired her message and her mission in life. So I want to introduce you to Dr. Pamela Pine, and I am actually going to read you her bio so that I don't mess this up. Dr. Pamela is an international health, development, and communication expert who concentrates on helping women and underserved groups. Her key focus for the last couple of decades is preventing and limiting the impact of child sexual abuse, CSA, and other adverse childhood experiences, which are also called ACEs. She is the founder and former CEO of Stop the Silence, a department of the Institute of Violence, Abuse, and Trauma. Dr. Pamela, is it okay if I call you Dr. Pamela, or how would you prefer to be called?
Yeah, honestly, Dr. Pamela, Dr. Pine, Pamela, Pam, whatever you're comfortable with, I'll go with.
Well, I like to honor people that have done that hard work and got that doctorate. So let's go with Dr. Pamela.
Sure.
Dr. Pamela, welcome, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much for having me. This is an important topic that's often overlooked when we're talking about the health of families and children.
Yes. So before we jump into the content that we want to cover, tell us a little bit about why this became your mission and your passion, because I've heard you speak on this topic, and it definitely is something that embodies what you want to see changed in the world, right?
Yeah, there's a long story. I'll keep it as short as possible about how I got involved with all of this. I was working in international public health and around the world, literally around the world. And in the year 2000, some information came across my desk from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And it was a very, very early call for proposals on interpersonal violence. And because my sister was a therapist and was working closely with survivors of child sexual abuse, I navigated to that. And I started reading, and I will tell you, Marty, I was bowled over. I was shocked at the numbers. I was shocked at the outcomes and the impact. And it was particularly amazing to me that after all the perhaps over education that I hadn't had one course in child trauma or protection. That was amazing. And I checked with my very esteemed colleagues, and they were in the same boat. So we had gotten through all this public health education without any background or knowledge in the amount of child trauma, the amount of adverse childhood experiences, and specifically the amount of child sexual abuse that occurs, nor were we taught about the outcomes. And this is a major public health problem. And I'll just add that domestic violence is considered as one of those 10 adverse childhood experiences.
Yeah. And so thank you for bringing this up, because I think there's so many professions that work with children or work in the public health area that have either no training or very limited training. And I hate to say this, but some of the decision makers in the family court system have, maybe taken one course, and that was 10 or 15 years ago. And there's right now, there's not a lot of requirements for people working with families, either through the divorce system or in school systems or anything else, to really have extensive education. Now, teachers and school districts do require regular ongoing training on child sexual abuse and child abuse issues. But again, it's not really terribly extensive. It's very narrow kind of reporting requirements and signs to look for and what to say and what not to say, but it's very limited, really.
It's not extensive and it's not cohesive. And
Right.
they often are not really taught the signs or the symptoms or the full impact that these kinds of adverse childhood experiences or ACEs have on the kids.
Right.
And when we're talking domestic violence, being one of the ACEs, we know the kind of trauma that occurs as a result of the exposure to the ACEs, to the adverse childhood experiences, and to the domestic violence. We know about this, but we're not doing enough about it.
Right, right. And so we're going to approach this conversation from how for people that are in the divorce process, or people that are considering divorce, or people that are in a toxic relationship and staying in it. When I say toxic, I'm talking about some kind of abuse: physical, mental, emotional, financial, all of those abuses, coercive control, all of that kind of stuff. We want to talk about busting the myth that staying in these relationships is actually better for the kids. It's better for the kids. And I hear this all the time. Well, it's not that bad. The children have never seen it. The children don't know what's happening, blah, 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 blah. I'm sorry, your children do know. And I'm sorry if that hurts you, but you have to understand. But before we move into that, you mentioned a term a couple of times that I would like you to define for us and share a bit more. And that's that term ACEs. Can you tell us a
Sure.
little more about what that is?
Yeah, generally speaking, most people identify 10 different adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, and they include physical abuse of a child, emotional abuse of a child, neglect of a child, sexual abuse of a child, having a parent incarcerated, overusing illicit drugs or alcohol, domestic violence, and I always leave out a couple others, but there are a couple of others, and all of those have the potential of creating real trauma in the minds and the hearts and the souls of little children, not only little children, but older children as well. And we have to keep this in mind, because what we're doing by staying or keeping the status quo is setting these kids up for generational problems. What we know is that often people in domestic violence relationships have come out of domestic violence relationships. And so when we are sitting with our kids and accepting that situation for them, there is a fair amount of risk for those children when they grow up to get into the same kind of relationships. Sometimes people kid around and they say things like, well, girls marry their fathers, someone like their fathers, and boys marry someone like their mothers. There's actual truth to that,
Mm-hmm.
because we are attracted, so to speak, by people who carry certain types of emotional traits. And so when we grow up, we unconsciously are looking for these traits, and the kids, as adults, then find them. So I'm not saying break apart your families under all circumstances. I'm not saying that certain families and relationships can't be healed and strengthened and improved and be positive for the family and for the children. But I am saying be aware of the risks that you're exposing your kids to.
Yes, and I so appreciate that message because, and I, for the life of me, I cannot think of it. I think there was a study done, gosh, it's got to be 10 or 15 years ago. The wingspan project where they actually studied incidents of domestic violence, and then coercive control and stuff wasn't really a well-known thing. So it was more the physical side of domestic violence and the emotional side. So put downs, yelling, screaming, gaslighting, manipulating, all that kind of stuff that we now look at under that toxic category. That if it was a single incident, like there was a single incident of domestic violence, that may not be indicative of what the relationship was going to be long term, and that there was the potential that could be healed and the family could work through that. On the other hand, what they found is that when there's ongoing or long term or chronic abuse within the family, that's when the risk of damage to the children escalates incrementally with how long they're exposed to this kind of negativity. And sorry, go ahead.
No, how long and repetitively.
Yes.
And there is a cumulative effect of all of this. And children will react in all sorts of ways, either in anger or shutting down or running away or what have you. In fact, what we also know is that the kids who run away, there's nothing, there's something behind that. And it often has to do either with their own abuse and or the abuse that they're seeing and experiencing in their families.
Sure. And as a school teacher that worked as a behavioral consultant with after I got my master's, and interestingly, I did my master's on children who are abused, who then abuse within school systems, abuse their peers. That was my master's. And so this is a very real thing. And one of the things I want to put out here is this is not to blame a person who finds themselves in a domestic violence situation.
Absolutely not.
It is just to make people aware that don't listen when your partner tells you it's better for the kids if you just take it. Because it's going to be better for your kids. Or if your religious leader says that, or if your friends say that, or your family says it. This is just information for you. And you're going to need support to get out of that relationship. We all recognize that. And our hearts are with you. And there are services out there. So if you can't find services in your area, reach out to myself. And I will do my best to track down somebody in your area that can help you. So this is for information, not to blame or judge or add more guilt to somebody who's already living in this very difficult situation. So, Dr. Pamela, how can we, let's say we're recognizing that this is happening. What are some of the other signs we might look for as a parent, noticing changes in our kids? I know the big ones, the running away. What might be some other things that parents notice of kids at different ages?
They might notice, depending upon the type of abuse, but I think we're going to stick with domestic violence here. Yes?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. With regard to their developmental stage, as I think most of us know. So a child will react differently in different stages. A small child might run into their bedroom, pull the covers over their head. You might find them weepy or sobbing, or changes in behavior in terms of preschool or school. Find them being afraid to be with other people or to socialize, being uncomfortable, not doing well in school. Perhaps they were doing well, but there's so much on these kids' minds, and they're afraid for themselves as well as afraid for their parent. The other kinds of things that happen as a child gets older, in adolescence, for example, a boy might start standing up for his mother and getting into violent situations with a perpetrator.
Yes.
There's also eating problems that go along with a lot of the emotional turmoil that can result as a impact of adverse childhood experiences, including domestic violence. So eating, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, all of those kinds of things we see at different stages of development of the child.
And sometimes I know, well, I have found from my experience in the school system is sometimes these kids start acting out at school. So they
Right.
may become very aggressive at school, or they may become very timid at school. They may have emotional outbursts. And I really appreciate you said, like, they may stop not wanting, or they may start not wanting to go to school if they've always enjoyed school before, or they may find a lot of reasons, especially when they get older, to not come home. In other words, they're staying at their friend's house all the time, or maybe they say they're staying at their friend's house and they're really just sleeping out somewhere,
Right.
because their home is no longer a safe or a comfortable or a good place to
Exactly.
be for these kids.
Exactly. I mean, a parallel kind of statistic is that I think it's 95% of, what is it, 75%? I don't have the statistic in my head anymore. Maybe it's 73% of kids who run away are running away because of abusive situations in the home.
Right. Well, and you see that, and you see those documentary on kids that are living on the streets. And most of these kids say that they were sexually abused or physically abused in their home, or there was, mom and dad were constantly fighting, and there was
Right.
that lack of, if your family is the most disruptive place that you can be, you can see why anywhere else would be a
Certainly.
good place to be. Yeah.
And another point is to recognize that often, not always, but often, various types of ACEs go together. So if there's domestic violence, there's a higher risk of the children being directly abused as well.
Right.
So we have to keep that in mind. It's not just the mom, after all, or usually the mom, it's usually the woman, but it's also the fact that the kids may be at additional risk for violence or other types of abuse as well from the perpetrator.
Right. If you don't mind, and let's talk a little bit about this idea that um, the kids are not being abused physically, and the kids have never seen the fights between mom and dad, or the abuse between the parents. And I agree with you. It's mostly women, but there's more and more men now are starting to step up, and thank goodness, to talk about being abused physically, emotionally, coercive control within the relationship. So let's say this abuse is going on and the parents feel, well, the kids have never seen it, so therefore they can't be impacted. Can you talk a little bit about that
I
myth?
think that the emotional fallout, so to speak, from a domestic violence situation is felt by everyone in the home. Whether that parent, the victim, the parent victim, is expressing fear or depression or anger because of her situation, there is, I would say, always some fallout somewhere. And it's going to impact the kids whether or not they are seeing this violence against a parent. So we really have to be cognizant of that. We need to pay attention to that. We need to understand that I mean, all we have to do is think of ourselves, right? If we have a bad day, what happens? We might go home and take it out on the people. Some people go home and take it out on the dog or the cat or what have you, or other animals. These are real manifestations of a condition, whether seen or not, because of our own emotional responses.
Right, right. And the other thing I was going to say about the kids, and I think this is something that maybe parents don't even realize they do, but they coerce the kids into the narrative that there's nothing wrong in our family. And so even the person who is the victim in the abuse may be using an element of coercive control on their children by saying, don't tell anybody, don't go to school and tell anybody, because they will come and take you away. And
Right.
so I understand why it's happening, but we have to also acknowledge that when we participate in that, we are using a form of coercive control on our own children, even though that may not be our intent. That really puts those kids in a bind because they want to tell somebody.
Absolutely. And that does put them in a bind and it makes them very uncomfortable. And what it does also, like everything else, sets them up for certain behaviors in the future to either be attracted by some behaviors from other people or to present those behaviors when they get into relationships as they get older. That the issue of coercive control, which has now become a very common thing to talk about, is critical. And we are setting ourselves up and our children up and generations henceforth up for problems within their own relationships.
Yes, yes. That's another thing. And I would like you, if you don't mind, to talk a little bit about that whole idea of the generational impact. I know you mentioned it at the very beginning, but I think this is something that, as a person who might be in this toxic environment, I think it's really important to understand that it's not just you that's dealing with it, that there can be impacts to your kids, your grandkids, your great grandchildren. Can you talk a little bit about how that generational impact occurs?
Absolutely. And it has to do with that concept of what you're doing is teaching children, and they will react in a conscious or unconscious way with the same kind of behavior. And again, I'll go back to each and every one of us. All we have to do is think about how we were raised and what traits we then presented to the world. And I think that I'll speak for myself because everybody can relate to everybody's situation. I grew up in a good family, good family. I mean, very supportive, loving, and all of that business. And at the same time, of course, there were traits that were difficult traits in my family. And I have been working on those traits for over 6 decades at this point. And you want to work those things out, and they're not easy because they are so a part of your very being, and you emulate those traits, you repeat those traits, you learn those traits, and you continue with those traits. I would challenge anybody, any listener right now, or anybody, frankly, in the world, to say that there are no traits that they like or dislike that aren't part of their very, very early beginnings. And so that generational quality only makes sense, really. We do repeat those things generation after generation after generation. And if we're lucky, and if we're smart, and if we work hard, maybe we will work those things through. But all the better to never have to deal with them and prevent that rather than struggle through the healing process.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's the gift we can give our kids. And if you're sitting here and you're listening and you're starting to feel like, oh my gosh, what have I done to my kids? Don't feel that way, because there are ways to work through this. Trauma informed therapy, trauma informed coaching, working on personal development and sharing that with your children. There's lots of ways to work through this. But the longer you stay in those situations, the harder it's going to be to fully heal and recover from them. At least that's my take on it. I don't know if you agree.
I do agree with that. The repetitive nature, as we said before, the repetitive nature, the length of the exposure, so to speak, to certain behaviors, the more difficult it's going to be for the child.
And so let me throw this out here, because I know we're talking a little bit about busting some of the myths that I hear quite often with my divorce clients, my divorcing clients, and that I heard again in my past career as a domestic violence client advocate. Is one of the things I heard a lot was, but was the abuse is not that bad. It's never got physical. Can you talk about the impact of, or is there an impact to, just the nasty comments, just the put downs? Well, he just calls me names, or she just yells at me. It's really not that big of a deal because there's nothing physical. Can you talk
Well,
about that?
Yes. Well, those kinds of insults and barbs to who we are and how we feel about themselves also impact the children and the woman, the victim, whoever, whether male or female, that person's going to be impacted as well with that, because it's an assault on your self-esteem and how you carry yourself in the world and how you feel about yourself. And I think we also know, I mean, I know we know that those kinds of things are an assault and that they often, not always, but often escalate. So the emotional abuse, the name calling, all of those kinds of things can and often do escalate to the physical violence. And I think we need to be aware of that as well and hold that in our minds. Years and years ago, I worked in a domestic violence shelter, and very, very quickly, I got aware and knowledgeable about the patterns that are seen in domestic violence relationships. And one woman came in one day, and I was doing an intake, and she told me just a smidgen about herself. And I said to her, and I bet every single time he hurts you or hits you or punches you or does something to you, he tells you afterwards that he loves you and it will never, ever happen again. And I went on like that for a while, and she looked at me and she said, "How do you know the story of my life?"
Right.
Well, I know the story of her life because these are patterns that escalate. And we don't want to provide that kind of environment on an ongoing basis for ourselves or our children because we're all impacted.
Yes, yes. Thank you. And like you, I mean, it was, and the sad thing was, so many of the women at the point in time where they actually do reach out to come to a domestic violence shelter are already, they have no access to funds. They've been taken off all the credit cards. They're given a little allowance. It's really takes a lot of courage sometimes to just even walk through the door of a domestic violence shelter, because in the back of their mind, they know what's going to happen because of this action. And so it takes a lot of courage. I just want to say that up
It
front
takes,
for anybody.
I agree completely. It takes a lot of courage, and it also takes a lot of stamina. As we know, women will go into a domestic violence shelter 5 to 7 times before they actually leave the perpetrator. And those kinds of situations will just be perpetuated and perpetuated if we actually learned the signs and symptoms beforehand and got into relationships knowing what some red flags are for ourselves and our current or our future children. Everybody would be better off if we knew how to set the boundaries so that if you cross a major boundary, you know that this is not a healthy relationship.
Right.
And if we did our jobs as educators and trainers and provided information to people so that they would know what they are looking for and what is acceptable and what's not acceptable, we would be doing the world a favor because we'd be stopping it in its tracks. We would stop it before it began, and we'd
Right.
all be better off.
Right. And let's face it. I mean, if you got into this relationship and you're sitting in a emotional, physical, neglectful, domestic violence, physical, any kind of abusive relationship, that person didn't behave that way on your first date. They
Right.
know what they're doing. They're not they don't have a huge repertoire, but they have one that they just rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. And it's that, sometimes they call it, what is it, the honeymoon cycle, where,
Right.
there's the abuse happens. They love bomb you. They make apologies. They do their very best for about 2 months, and then there's a trigger, and then it happens again and again.
Right, right.
And and so you're right. And I do think, though, the good thing is I'm seeing several schools in different countries and different areas are now, in at least at the high school level, talking about healthy dating relationships, and for both boys and girls, what to watch out for, like what is coercive control, and why it's unhealthy if your partner threatens you if you won't have sex with them, or if you won't drink with them, or if you won't do drugs with them. And they talk about all of those things quite openly. I just wish that it would be part of a standard curriculum and not just individual.
A standard curriculum, but also I think that we forget that little kids, they understand a lot more than we give them credit for.
Yeah.
And talking to them early on about difficult situations in developmentally appropriate ways, but talking to them nonetheless, that's also a favor that we are doing for our children. I started talking to my kids, I've worked for now years, 25 years in child sexual abuse. And there are ways. I mean, I started talking to my kids about these kinds of things when they were very young,
Right.
very young.
Right.
And they weren't traumatized because I did it in a developmentally appropriate way. They weren't traumatized, but they thought about it. They took it in. They recognized what behaviors they were willing and not willing to accept.
Right.
I watched my daughter she was a beautiful, slim, blonde. I mean, she attracted a lot of attention, but she had the tools to say no.
Right.
And I taught her that no was a fine word to use. And at one point, she had talked to me when she was in college about the number of people that she knew who had been sexually assaulted. She never has been. And I think part of that is because she had some tools in her toolbox about how to behave or where to go or what to do or what to say and what not to say in certain circumstances.
Right.
So, we need to take that responsibility and give those tools, give that information to our kids. And if you don't know how to do it directly, there are plenty of kids' books that can help you along.
Right. And you can read the book and talk to your child. One of the things that I think is the biggest mistake that we've ever done is the whole stranger danger thing, because most abuse does not occur from a stranger. That's the kind of, now there are cases, and they're horrific, of course. Every kind of child abuse is horrific. But teaching kids, don't let a stranger touch you anywhere your bathing suit covers. That's a great, easy thing for kids to understand. But what about the uncle, the aunt, the cousin, the father, the mother? I mean, any kind of inappropriate touch by anybody should be something that kids are aware should not be happening. And I think, like you say, a kid's not going to be able to stand up to an adult. I'm not suggesting that, but hopefully they would understand and then talk to other adults about it and not be, again, coerced into keeping it quiet. Unfortunately, that's the game plan of the abuser, right? Don't tell, because if you tell, I'm going to hurt your mommy. I'm going to kill your dog. I'm going, these people say all kinds of
laugh at you. People won't believe you.
Right.
You won't get all these nice gifts. I mean, it's on and on and on. And so again, just going back and reiterating and underscoring, we need to talk to the kids.
Yeah.
We need to give them more credit than I think most people do in terms of their capability of understanding.
Yes. And I know this has been like, we've kind of covered a whole big range of topics here, but I think this is so important because I'm going to go back to the original reason why you and I decided to share this information is because there are so many myths about divorce and domestic violence and the importance of staying together as a family and somehow making it work. And yes, if you can, that's fantastic. But safeguards still need to be put in place during the initial, I'm going to say, retraining of the abuser, because you can't just expect that they're just going to go, okay, well, gosh, I never realized that hitting somebody was going to hurt them. Come on, they know that. As an adult, you know that, unless there's some kind of cognitive deficit or something like that. But, you know, there are opportunities to make these things right and to correct wrongs. And sometimes abusers are like that because that's the only way they've known in a relationship. But that doesn't mean they get excuses to continue to hurt you or your children or your grandchildren or other family members. So
under any circumstances.
Right.
And I would say to people that the first time it happens, that should be a huge red flag. And either it gets addressed then and it truly gets worked out, or some other plan of action is necessary.
Right, right. And that's one thing I was going to throw in there, is that often that first time is associated with alcohol or drug use. And then the excuse is, well, I wouldn't have done it except for I was drunk or I was high. And then that becomes almost the excuse to continue to do it. And it's kind of like, well, I wasn't in my right mind, so you can't hold me accountable for it because I was under the influence. And that's simply not true. If it happens once, it needs to be addressed. I so agree with you.
Yeah.
So we have covered a ton of information. Is there anything that you think that needs to be said that we didn't say, or a question that needs to be answered that didn't get asked?
No, I don't think so. I would say, if I may, if you're looking for information or help with regard to the exposure of your child to adverse childhood experiences, there is information that we provide. And if I may provide a website.
Please, yes.
It's https://www, and then it's ithatcenters.org, and I'm going to spell that because it's kind of long. It's IVAT centers with an S, so IVATCENTERS.org. And then Stop the Silence, as a department of IVAT, has its own page. So if you wanted to, you could go put a slash and put stop dash the dash silence, and you'll go right to our page. Or you could just land on ivatcenters.org and go to our page. You can navigate to our page from there.
And I'll make sure that all gets in the show notes. I'm also going to include the National Domestic Violence Hotline. And if you are in a crisis situation or you have concerns about getting out, they can connect you with a local, in the United States anyhow, they can connect you with local resources. And I think I also have the domestic violence lines for several countries. I'll put those in the show notes. Great. And then if you can't find your something in your area, you can always reach out to me. My contact information is in the show notes, and I will do my best to track things down, or call your local domestic violence shelter, or reach out to talk with them. Dr. Pine, thank you so much for being here today. And I know this is a really tough topic to talk about, and I know it's hard for women that are stuck in these relationships, because it really can feel like you're stuck. But please, there are resources. Reach out, get the help. And if you don't get the help the first time, keep reaching out. Talk to other women in your community. Women are sometimes the best resources at helping other women get out of these situations. So,
and I might say it's so good of you to be providing this information to so many people and on a regular basis. It's critical. We need to inform the world, and we would be making the world a better place as a result.
I think that's a perfect way to end this up. Dr. Pamela Pine, thank you so much for being here today.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
And thank you all for listening to this episode of Spotlight on the Divorce Expert. If you want to leave a comment, that's fine. If you don't want to leave a public comment, reach out to me privately, and I'd be happy to answer or help out in any way I can.